Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we explore the fascinating and sometimes difficult relationship between creativity and mental illness. You might think of a famous writer spending his days looking at seashells. It's a bit strange, but that's exactly what we're diving into today with Edgar Allan Poe.
It's true. Poe's The Concretologist's first book is quite different from those Gothic stories we usually think about with him. But when you think about all the money problems he had, maybe a little side job in science isn't that surprising.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. It seems like money problems followed Poe his whole life. But let's back up a little bit and give our listeners some context. Born in Boston back in 1809, Poe's life was really unstable right from the start.
Absolutely. Both his parents were actors, which, meant he was around art and performing from when he was really little. His mother, Elizabeth, was really a talented actress. She even played some Shakespeare roles.
Wow, over 200 roles. That's incredible. But sadly, a stable family life wasn't really going to happen for Poe. His father left the family, and then just a few years later, his mother died.
It's really sad. He was just a little kid when he was orphaned, and then John and Frances Allen from Richmond took him in. And the Allen is important here because that's where Poe gets his middle name.
Right, and we should point out, this wasn't a simple adoption. The relationship with the Allens was complicated.
Yeah, it really was. They gave him a good education and even took him to Scotland and England for school. But there was always this tension, like Poe never really felt like he belonged.
I could see how that instability early on, never having a stable family, might have something to do with all the psychological turmoil we see in his writing later on.
Absolutely. And then things got even more turbulent when Poe went to the University of Virginia. He was a great student academically, but he got into a lot of debt from gambling. John Allen refused to help him out, and that caused a big rift between them.
So we're seeing a pattern here. Losing his parents early on, a difficult relationship with his foster father, and now this self-destructive gambling. Like Poe was always trying to escape, pushing the limits.
That's a really good observation. And that's what leads him to enlist in the U.S. Army using a fake name, Edgar A. Perry.
A fake name already. That's fascinating. It's like he was trying to erase his past, create a whole new identity. But even in the Army, he couldn't stop writing.
Exactly. He published his first book of poems, Tamerlane and Other Poems, while he was still in the Army. It didn't get a lot of attention then, but looking back, you can see some of the themes and style that would define his later work.
So even in these early poems, back in 1827, we're seeing those themes of darkness, sadness, beauty, mixed with tragedy, all those things that would become so important in his writing.
Exactly. And those themes get even stronger in his second book of poems, Al-Araf, which came out in 1829 after he left the Army. This time, the critics started paying attention. They saw his unique voice and how well he used language.
It's interesting how his writing career seems to happen alongside his personal life, getting more and more chaotic. He's getting recognition as a writer, but his relationship with John Allen keeps getting worse, and he's always struggling to make money.
Right. And this is when his Aunt Maria Clem and her daughter Virginia come into the picture. They become his family, the stable part of his life amidst all the chaos.
But even this relationship is kind of controversial, right? Poe eventually marries Virginia when she's only 13, which was a really big deal back then.
It was a very controversial marriage, for sure. And even though they seem to have really loved each other, it was a tragic relationship. Virginia was sick a lot, and then she died from tuberculosis in 1847.
Losing her just devastated Poe. It made his obsession with death, grief, and fragile beauty even stronger. And during this time when he was suffering so much, he wrote some of his most famous work.
Absolutely. The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher. These masterpieces came out of all that loss and turmoil, and they really cemented his place in literary history. And they make us really think about that link between being a genius and suffering.
It's almost like his art became his way of dealing with all that pain, a way of facing the darkness that was threatening to overwhelm him.
Yes, and what's so interesting about Poe is that he doesn't just talk about these dark themes on the surface. He takes the reader right into the depths of the human mind, making us confront these disturbing realities of obsession, guilt, and madness.
His stories are often told from the perspective of narrators you can't really trust, blurring the lines between sanity and insanity, what's real and what's not. He's a master at creating these claustrophobic atmospheres, pulling the reader into the narrator's unstable mental state.
Think about The Telltale Heart, for example. The narrator keeps saying he's totally sane, but his actions and the way he obsesses over the old man's heartbeat tell a different story. He's clearly on the edge of madness.
It's both brilliant and scary. Poe doesn't shy away from the grotesque, the disturbing. He makes us face those dark parts of human nature, that potential for violence and evil that we all have inside us.
And The Fall of the House of Usher is another great example of how Poe uses symbolism and atmosphere to create a sense of dread. The Usher mansion, which is falling apart, becomes a symbol of the psychological decay happening to Roderick Usher and his twin sister, Madeline.
Right, and their relationship, which is kind of disturbing, adds another layer of complexity to the story. Poe wasn't afraid to explore topics that were taboo, to challenge what society thought was acceptable in literature.
He was a true visionary, a pioneer of those dark and psychological elements that are now so common in horror and suspense writing.
But it's important to remember that Poe wasn't just about the macabre. His work also shows a deep sensitivity to beauty, a love of language, and a fascination with the mysteries of the universe.
Absolutely. His poem Annabel Lee, for example, is this heartbreaking poem about a lost love. It shows the depths of grief and the power of love in language that's both beautiful and intensely personal.
And then there's The Raven, maybe his most famous work. It explores grief, loss, and the power of memory, using the symbol of the raven, the symbol of despair that keeps tormenting the narrator with its nevermore.
Poe's use of repetition and rhythm in that poem is amazing. It creates this hypnotic effect that's like the narrator's descent into madness, like the reader is being pulled down with him.
And we can't forget his contribution to detective stories. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, with its brilliant but strange detective C. Auguste Dupin, is considered one of the first real detective stories. It laid the groundwork for detectives like Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot.
It's really interesting how Poe manages to bring together all these different elements, the gothic, the romantic, the analytical, into a body of work that's so compelling.
So we've talked about a lot, from Poe's early life and what influenced him to his most famous works and the themes that run through his writing. It's clear his life was full of suffering and that his art was very connected to that suffering. But how do we understand this connection? Was his genius really born out of his pain?
That's a really complicated question, and one that we'll keep exploring as we look more closely at specific examples from his life and work. We need to look at how his experiences shaped how he saw the world, the creative choices he made, and his constant fascination with the darker side of human nature.
Right, and it's important to be sensitive and nuanced when we talk about this topic. We can't just say Poe's genius was simply because of his suffering, but we also can't ignore the huge impact that his struggles had on his art.
Exactly. So join us as we continue to try and unravel the mystery of Edgar Allan Poe, looking at specific works and digging deeper into this idea of the mad genius.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Before the break, we were talking about Edgar Allan Poe's life and how all that turmoil really shows up in his writing. We're saying that all those early experiences of loss and instability seem like they really shaped how he saw the world and fueled his creativity.
Yeah, we were starting to get into some of his most famous works, like The Telltale Heart, which is such a great example of how he explores the human mind. I'd love to hear more about how that story connects to this idea of genius and madness.
Well, in The Telltale Heart, Poe uses this unreliable narrator to blur those lines between being sane and insane. The narrator says he's being perfectly rational when he plans and then kills this old man. But his obsession with the old man's eye and how paranoid he gets throughout this story tell us something different.
It's like the reader is trapped inside the narrator's mind, experiencing his descent into madness firsthand. Poe doesn't give us any distance from the narrator's point of view, so we're forced to think about this disturbing possibility that genius and madness could be connected.
Exactly. And Poe makes this feeling of unease even stronger with the way he uses language. He uses repetition, vivid imagery, and this frantic, almost breathless pace to create a really strong sense of tension and dread.
The way he describes the sound of the old man's heart beating slowly, driving the narrator crazy, is so effective. You can almost hear the heartbeat pounding in your own ears as you read it.
It's definitely a visceral experience, and it shows how Poe could tap into our deepest fears and anxieties. He understood the power of the subconscious, how our darkest impulses can be hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly rational minds.
And that brings us to another famous work, The Fall of the House of Usher. This story takes that exploration of psychological decay even further.
Absolutely. The Usher mansion, which is falling apart, becomes a symbol of the Usher family's own mental and emotional breakdown. Roderick Usher and his twin sister, Madeline, are trapped in this decaying world, isolated both physically and mentally from the outside.
There's this feeling of claustrophobia and impending doom throughout the whole story. It's like the house itself is alive and slowly consuming its inhabitants.
And their relationship, with these hints of incest and codependency, adds another layer of psychological complexity. Poe wasn't afraid to explore those taboo subjects, challenging what society thought and forcing readers to confront those darker aspects of human nature.
You mentioned earlier that Poe wasn't only focused on the macabre. He also showed a real sensitivity to beauty and a fascination with the mysteries of the universe.
Right, that's really important. While he's known for his horror and suspense, there's another side to Poe that's just as interesting. His poem Annabel Lee is a great example. It's a really tender and sad poem about losing someone you love. It expresses those deep feelings of grief and the lasting power of love in language that's both lyrical and haunting.
There's this vulnerability and emotional depth in that poem that's really moving. It reminds us that even with all the darkness, Poe is capable of great tenderness and beauty.
And The Raven, which is probably his most famous work, also shows this duality. It's a dark and sad poem, for sure, exploring loss, grief, and the power of memory. But it also shows Poe's mastery of language and how he could evoke so many emotions.
The repetition of Nevermore, the vivid image of the raven sitting on the bust of Pallas, and the narrator's descent into madness, it all comes together to create this unforgettable literary experience.
Poe's use of sound and symbolism in The Raven is really something. He chose words specifically for how they sounded, creating this almost hypnotic effect that draws the reader into the narrator's world of despair and obsession.
And let's not forget what he did for the detective genre. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which introduced the brilliant but eccentric detective C. Auguste Dupin, is considered one of the first real detective stories. It was hugely influential on how the genre developed.
Poe's analytical mind is really on display in those stories. Dupin's ability to solve these seemingly impossible crimes through logic, observation, and deduction paved the way for iconic detectives like Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. It's interesting to see this other side of Poe's intellect, this sharp, analytical mind that's so different from the dark, emotional landscapes he explores in his other work.
It's like he embodies this duality of human nature, that ability to think rationally but also have irrational impulses, that capacity for profound beauty but also unsettling darkness.
Exactly. And that duality, that tension between opposing forces, is really at the heart of what makes Poe's work so fascinating and something people keep coming back to.
It seems like everything about his life and work comes back to this question of the mad genius. But before we get back into analyzing that connection, I think we should acknowledge all the personal tragedies that kept happening to Poe throughout his life.
You're right. We can't ignore the huge impact that his struggles had on his art and his mental state. His relationship with John Allan never really got better, and when Virginia died in 1847, he went into a deep depression.
His behavior became more and more erratic. People started talking about his drinking, affairs, and even suicide attempts. It's a sad reminder that even with all his literary success, Poe was fighting these inner demons that threatened to destroy him.
It's a tragic reminder that even the most brilliant genius doesn't make you immune to suffering. In Poe's case, it seems like his genius was completely tied to his pain.
So how do we, as readers who admire his work, reconcile these two seemingly opposite parts of Poe's legacy?
That's something we'll keep exploring as we look at the last few years of Poe's life and his lasting impact on literature.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We've been talking about Edgar Allan Poe, a man whose brilliance and inner turmoil are so closely linked. We know his personal tragedies had a huge impact on his writing, but how did his last years unfold?
Well, after Virginia died, Poe's life just spiraled even more. He drank more, his behavior became unpredictable, and he just couldn't find any stability, financially or emotionally. He moved around from one city to another, always searching for something, but he never seemed to find any peace.
It's sad to think of him like that, especially knowing that he was still creating such powerful and moving work. Like you said earlier, Annabel Lee and Ulalume were written during this time. Both poems are full of such raw grief and longing.
Exactly. Those poems show how talented he was, his ability to turn such intense personal pain into art. But while he was achieving these creative successes, there were also rumors of affairs, broken engagements, and behavior that some people considered pretty out there.
It's tough, isn't it? To acknowledge those struggles without downplaying his artistic accomplishments. Do you think those frolics, as he called them, were because of his grief and instability, or was there something more going on?
It's hard to know for sure, but some people who have studied his life think he might have had what we now call bipolar disorder or some other mental illness.
Yeah.
Those shifts between being intensely creative and then falling into deep despair are definitely something to consider.
Yeah, it makes you think that even being a genius doesn't protect you from the difficulties of life.
Yeah.
Actually, for someone like Poe, it seems like his genius might have even made those challenges worse.
That's a really interesting point. But even as his personal life fell apart, Poe never gave up on his dream of being a writer. Remember how he wanted to start a journal? One that would support American writers and really push the boundaries of literary criticism?
All right, it was a big dream, but it never happened. And then in 1849, when he was only 40 years old, Poe left Richmond for Philadelphia. It would be his last journey.
Yeah, a journey shrouded in mystery, just like a lot of his life. He was found delirious in a tavern in Baltimore. He was wearing clothes that weren't his and died a few days later in a hospital.
I remember reading about that and being surprised by how many questions there still are about his death. The theories range from alcohol poisoning to rabies to even murder. It's like his final act was to leave us with another chilling mystery.
It definitely adds to his mysterious image. But even though he died tragically and his life was so turbulent, Poe left behind a legacy that still resonates with readers everywhere.
That's what's so amazing. His work has gone beyond time, beyond genres, even beyond languages. He's seen as a pioneer of detective fiction, a master of the macabre, and a poet of incredible beauty and depth.
Yeah, his influence on writers who came after him is huge. From Arthur Conan Doyle and H.P. Lovecraft to Stephen King and Neil Gaiman, so many authors have been inspired by his dark vision, his exploration of psychology, and his skill with language.
And his work keeps being adapted for plays, movies, even video games. It seems like each generation finds something new and captivating in the way he explores the human psyche, our deepest fears, and that eternal struggle between good and evil.
So after spending all this time in Poe's world, where do you stand on that question of the mad genius, that connection between creativity and mental illness that we've been talking about?
Well, it's a complex question, and there aren't any easy answers.
Yeah.
But I think in Poe's case, it's clear that his genius and his struggles were deeply connected. His art was a reflection of his pain, his way of dealing with his experiences and facing the darkness both inside himself and in humanity as a whole.
I agree. We can't just say that his brilliance came from his suffering, but there's no denying that his personal demons played a big part in shaping his unique artistic vision.
He was a man of contradictions, capable of both profound beauty and disturbing darkness. He challenged what society thought, explored taboo topics, and pushed the limits of what was considered acceptable in literature.
And through it all, he never stopped writing, never stopped creating. His legacy reminds us that genius can come from the darkest places, and that being human is about both light and shadow.
Poe's work encourages us to face the uncomfortable, the disturbing, those parts of ourselves we'd rather not see. And by doing that, he reminds us that even in the darkest parts of the mind, there can be brilliance, moments of deep understanding that shed light on what it means to be human.
Thanks for joining us as we explored Edgar Allan Poe, a man whose life and work continue to fascinate, challenge, and inspire us.
We hope you'll keep exploring his world, his stories, his poems, and discover the enduring power of his dark and brilliant legacy.